The Miracle Glasses by Ludwig Boerne. In a beautiful town in the Orient once lived an old woman called Mariana. The people, however, called her the Spectacle Mother because she wore large spectacles with two thick, round lenses and a coarse horn frame. The old woman did not live where the large, magnificent houses stood, but far out in the poor people's quarter. There her little house was one of the most inconspicuous and smallest. It was just big enough for the old woman and her beautiful granddaughter Fatmine, who lived with her grandmother. But you must not think that Mariana, because she was so poor, was dissatisfied or displeased. On the contrary, it was not easy to find a happier person, and it was wonderful that she always found everything she had beautiful and good. She wore the same old, worn-out woolen dress in winter as in summer, but when people teased her or pitied her, the old woman laughed at her and said, "What do you want? My dress is beautiful and fine. I would not exchange it for the magnificent robe of a queen." When she drank her thin flour soup in the morning, she thought it was chocolate, and when she sat by her potatoes at noon, she could seldom cook anything else, and someone wanted to give her a piece of meat with it. She refused, and said that she had such delicious roast chicken that even the Sultan had nothing better on his table. In winter, the old woman sometimes had no money to buy firewood and to heat her stove, and it was bitterly cold in her little room. But she was not cold, for when she opened the stove door, she saw a merry little fire flickering in it, and she felt warm and comfortable. That the old woman looked at all things with such a satisfied look was due to her spectacles. Through them, everything looked nice and good. The whole world, seen through the glasses, seemed a true paradise. The people did not know that the spectacles had this magic power, and when they heard Mariana talk like that, they thought she did not have her right mind, and laughed at her. Others tried to convince Mariana that she was wrong, that her dress was old, her stove cold and her food bad, and they were angry and quarrelled with the old woman, who did not allow herself to be taught at all. Still others wanted to help Mariana with alms and gifts, and felt offended when she rejected the charitable gifts, and said, "I need nothing. I am as rich as the Sultan. You good people, just keep your things. You need everything much more than I do." So there had often been quarrels and vexations through no fault of Mariana's fault, and finally it had come to pass that the old woman lived with Fatmine apart from the people, and hardly met other people. They had only one guest with them, who never left them, and that was contentment. Today, however, they had gone among the people, for today was a feast day without equal for the city. The young Sultan Abdullah moved into his residence. A few months ago his father, very old and mourned by all the people, had died, and his son had succeeded him on the throne. First of all, the young prince had made a journey to the tomb of the prophet, and there had prayed 100 times 100 that God would grant him a happy government, and blessings and prosperity to his subjects. Then he had returned to his capital, and today was to be the entrance. So all the people were on the move. All windows, balconies and roofs were densely occupied. Those who had not found a place there stood on the broad main street through which the ruler was to ride to his palace. The crowd stood tightly packed on both sides of the street. Among the people in the front row was Mariana with her beautiful granddaughter, and was glad to see the Sultan soon, for she was a faithful soul, and loved the young sovereign, of whom many beautiful and good things were already to be told. Everything around her was festively dressed. Only poor Mariana, who had no festive clothes, had come in her everyday dress. So many people were angry and thought that the old woman should go away, that she did not fit in here, that she should at least step back so that the Sultan would not see her. But they didn't go down well with Mariana. She answered, "The Sultan will be glad to see me, for I have the most beautiful dress, and the Sultan himself certainly wears no better." But that went too far for the people. "What?" they cried. What is the old fool imagining? The Sultan is not to have a more beautiful dress than she, old lumpenlies? Thus there arose a loud quarrel, and the old woman would probably have fared badly. But then the Sultan came riding up, and at the sight of him everything else was quickly forgotten. They shouted enthusiastically, "Long live the Sultan!" And there was no end to the waving of handkerchiefs and flag waving, the flower greetings and shouts of joy. But how did the young prince come along? Handsomely and nobly educated, splendidly dressed, he graciously and joyfully thanked from his white tent on all sides for the festive reception, until he had disappeared into the gates of his palace. But the people had not yet seen enough of the sight of him. Again and again in the next few days it came together in bright crowds, as soon as the ruler showed himself. Mariana was also always among the crowd, although people always wanted to turn her away and told her not to show herself to the Sultan in her old dress. And as the quarrel did not cease at all, and even became more and more violent, the old woman, against whom all the world seemed to be so angry, at last caught the eye of the Sultan, and he sent his Grand Vizier to inquire into the cause of the quarrel. After Abdullah had been told about this, he ordered that old Mariana should be left alone. From then on she had peace from the people, and could admire the Sultan to her heart's content and undisturbed. Fatmeen stayed at home most of the time, for she was a very industrious, good child, and did not want to miss anything of her work. "I am still so young," she used to say. "I can still see so many beautiful things. Now I will go to work and let my grandmother go for a walk, who has already had to toil so much." When she returned in the evening, the old woman told the young girl all that she had seen and experienced, what the Sultan looked like, and what kind of garment he wore. "Yes," said Mariana, "that is strange. Every day you think that there can't be a more magnificent dress than the Sultan wears today, but the next day he wears an even more beautiful and magnificent one." And yet, the old woman faltered and seemed to sink into gloomy thoughts. Quite astonished, Fatmeen looked at her grandmother and asked, What do you think, grandmother?" "And yet," continued Mariana, after a moment's hesitation, "and yet the Sultan is no longer so splendid as he was. It seems to me that he is no longer as joyful as he was on the first days, and the way the bright joy shone out of his eyes, that was the most beautiful thing about him." "You must have been mistaken, grandmother." "But child, you know that my spectacles are not deceiving. What I see through them is correct." Fatmeen had to admit that, and she no longer objected. But the whole evening they both thought of the young prince, and wondered what could be the cause of his sorrow. But how frightened Fatmeen was when early the next morning a servant of the Sultan appeared and asked Mariana, in the name of his master, to come with him to the palace. "Oh Allah," she lamented, "the Sultan will not be angry and have my grandmother beheaded." Mariana calmed the child as much as she could, and went with her in good spirits. In the palace she saw all the glories that are otherwise close to the people, high, wide halls of marble and ebony, studded with gold, pearls and precious stones, and adorned with the most beautiful paintings and the most costly carpets. Everywhere fountains spread coolness and fragrances. In the most magnificent hall sat the Sultan on a golden chair. When the old woman entered, he ordered all his ministers and officers to go out, and Mariana sat down beside his armchair. It seemed difficult for him to say anything. A few times he wanted to start talking, but he always stopped. But at last he said, "Mariana, can you guess why I sent for you?" "No, I am an old, simple-minded woman. I do not know what my lord and Sultan could want of me. I have been told," continued Abdullah, "that you are always content, that you find everything in your life beautiful and good and well arranged." "That is true," answered Mariana. "I am quite satisfied, but wouldn't it be the greatest sin if I weren't? But you are quite poor, Mariana. You have no palace and no costly furniture and beautiful gardens, no servants, no noble horses, no good food. And that's not true. Mariana interrupted him. I have good food too, perhaps better than you. This morning I drank a chocolate. You've probably never had anything so good. You needn't laugh at that, she went on a little angrily, as the Sultan smiled. And even if I have no palace and beautiful gardens, and all that you have, I am not poor for that. My house is beautiful too. Then she began to tell the Sultan how pretty it was with her, and though small, yet pleasant and comfortable. Better, she said at last. No one can have it at all but you, noble sir. Yes, you see, Mariana, I have all the beauty there can be in the world. When I wake up in the morning, a servant hands me delicious mocha, a slave sings soft songs to the lute, another fans me with coolness. Then poets come to read their verses to me, artists crowd forward to show me their new works, and the wisest men vie with each other to entertain me by profound conversations. Before I have expressed a wish, nay, before I have even suspected it, it is already fulfilled. And yet I am not happy and satisfied. What I hear and see seems to me dull and boring. Nothing gives me real pleasure. And the days are getting so long that in the morning I wish, if only it were evening and time to go to bed. The Sultan paused as if waiting for a word from the old woman, but she looked thoughtfully before her and said nothing. That is why, Mariana, continued the Sultan, the first have sent for you. My Grand Vizier told me that you were always glad. Now you should tell me how that happens. If you will tell me the secret of how you do it, I will reward you royally. Mariana took off her glasses and said, Try these spectacles, sir. Then maybe it will get better. But you must clean it yourself for half an hour every morning and every evening, or it will become cloudy. Tomorrow let yourself be awakened early in the morning, preferably at sunrise, and then make the first test. With these words, the old woman gave the Sultan her spectacles and went away. She didn't want to know anything about thanks and rewards. Abdullah was eager to try the spectacles, and he could hardly wait for evening to come. Then he went to bed early and ordered his servants to wake him up at sunrise the next morning. And that is what happened. And when the crowd of servants entered the bedchamber to ask for the Sultan's orders, the people almost fell on their backs in amazement, for something quite unheard of, something unprecedented had happened. The Sultan had jumped out of bed quite alone and without help, and now he ordered all the servants to go out, for he wanted to dress himself. As soon as the people were outside, he sat down in his shirt as he was, took a silk handkerchief, and cleaned his spectacles with it quite conscientiously for half an hour, so that sweat ran down his forehead from the unaccustomed work. Then he dressed himself quickly, and then went into the garden with his spectacles on his nose. The Sultan did not know what had happened to him. The world seemed to him changed, and he himself believed that he had become a different person. He felt more comfortable and joyful than he had ever felt for a long time, nay, at all. How brightly the sun shone, how the fresh dewdrops were emblazoned on all the grasses and blossoms, and how spicy and fresh the cool morning air blew around his temples. He was drawn further and deeper into the garden, and he walked paths that he had never walked before, not the elaborately laid-out avenues studded with palm trees, camellias, and magnolias, which led to grottos and marble images, to small temples and pavilions. No, he was drawn to one side, where trees grew wild, towering plane trees and gnarled oaks, and where forget-me-nots and violets, men's loyalties and buttercups stood in a colourful confusion on a green meadow. It all seemed so wonderful to the Sultan, and he thought that he must have been blind so far that he had been able to pass it all by without paying attention. How beautiful was every blade of grass, some tall and stocky, others slender and dainty, moved by every breath of wind. The whole meadow in the morning dew resembled a silvery veil. Inside the crickets chirped, and the frogs croaked from the nearby pond. To the Sultan this sounded sweeter than the usual singing and mandolin playing. He picked up many a little flower, here a white, a blue, there a red or yellow. Full of reverent amazement he saw how richly the dear god has surrounded even the smallest with beauty and grace, to the delight of those who walk through his glorious world with open eyes and free mind. For sheer pleasure he rolled about in the meadow, and at last he even did a somersault in the grass. But he was a little frightened at this. For he thought, what will people say when they see that I, the mighty Sultan, the ruler of so many millions, am doing a somersault? But fortunately no one had seen it but a little white Spitz, who came barking merrily and jumped up on the Sultan. Otherwise he would not have noticed the little animal, but now, in his cheerful humour, he gladly put up with the company of the merry little animal. The dog hopped ahead and the Sultan always with him over fields and meadows, for how long neither of them knew. Gradually, however, Abdullah became very strange and somewhat uncomfortable. He had a feeling in his stomach that he didn't know, but that tormented him. Was there an evil worm in there that gnawed at him? The Sultan did not know, and the Spitz could give him no information. Suddenly, not far away, hidden behind trees, he saw a small house. In front of it sat an elderly man with his wife and son. Everyone had spades, rakes and hoes beside them. They were country people who had just worked in the fields and were now eating their breakfast, milk, soup and black bread. They did not know the Sultan, but when he asked them quite kindly if he could not eat with them, they invited him cordially. The Sultan always ate one piece of bread after another, and one dish of milk soup after another, and the good people rejoiced with all their hearts to see how their guest liked it. He couldn't praise the food enough and insisted again and again that it had never tasted so good to him in his whole life. He did not want to believe that the black bread had been with milk soup, and thought that he must have eaten something particularly fine. "Oh no, sir," said the old man, "you must have been very hungry. That's why you liked it so much." But Abdullah said, "I do not know hunger. I have never had it before, and certainly not now." And he begged the people to be allowed to come back soon. They gladly agreed to this, but did not accept the ring which the stranger wanted to give them. "For," they said, "we have not taken you in for a reward, but for the sake of God and your happy and good eyes. Farewell, sir, and come back soon." The Sultan went back to his palace with heartfelt gratitude with Spitz, who had also been allowed to fortify himself with milk soup. There he found everyone in great excitement, for they had already feared that some misfortune might have befallen him. But they quickly calmed down when they saw the Sultan, and were only surprised at his cheerful humour and his large spectacles. And because they thought they had to imitate their master, they all showed funny faces and put spectacles on their noses. But these were ordinary spectacles, not magic spectacles, such as the Sultan had. They were of no use. Only the spectacle makers had good days, rubbing their hands happily and laughing to themselves. Thus Abdullah lived for several weeks in great contentment, and if he had any sorrow, it was only that old Mariana would not accept any reward at all, nor would she come to the palace again. "I'm quite superfluous there now," she said, "and I like it best at home in my peace." Then it happened one day that the Sultan received a visit from the mighty Caliph Beniro Baibai. The Caliph had already been friends with Abdullah's father, and he now came to greet the young ruler on his way to the tomb of the Prophet. He brought with him many hundreds of servants, each dressed more and more expensively than the other. They all sat on stately horses or ponderous camels, and it took half an hour for the last one to enter the gates of the palace. Then a feast was celebrated in honour of the distinguished guest, to which all the great of the country were invited. There was the best food, and the wine was also bravely awarded, and he, as you know, made him trusting and talkative. The Caliph did so, and so he asked the Sultan towards the end of the table, "Abdullah, What kind of spectacles have you got on your doll? It is not beautiful. Your eye is good, so why do you wear them?" The Sultan smiled and answered, "The spectacles are a very precious thing. They are worth more to me than half my kingdom. That's why I clean it myself for half an hour every morning and every evening, so that it stays pretty and bright." At this, Boerne laughed at the top of his voice, so that the Sultan even became a little angry. But he did not let himself be noticed, because the other was his guest, and only asked him why he was laughing so much. "Yes," said the Caliph, "that is too amusing. It has never happened to me that a sultan does anything himself. Do you clean your boots yourself?" "No," Abdullah replied somewhat meekly. "Well then," said Boerne, "if you want to wear the spectacles, so be it, but you won't clean them yourself anymore. That's too cute an idea of yours." Because the Caliph laughed so heartily, Abdullah finally had to laugh with him, and they toasted together, were the best of friends again, and soon talked of something else. At midnight, Boerne mounted his horse and went on with his companions. Because of the great heat, he wanted to ride at night. The Sultan went to his bedroom. He was very tired and exhausted, but he sat down on a chair, as he had been accustomed to for a long time, and took off his glasses to clean them. But suddenly the Caliph's mocking words came to his mind, and then he was so tired. "Ah, today," thought the Sultan, "my faithful Ibrahim can help me for once." He therefore gave the old servant his spectacles, with orders to clean them carefully for half an hour, lay down and fell asleep at once. The next morning, as always, the spectacles lay next to the Sultan's bed. But he did not get up as cheerfully as usual, for he had a guilty conscience and was worried that the glasses might have become cloudy. So he breathed a sigh of relief when he looked through the spectacles and found them just as bright and clear as before. He praised his old Ibrahim, and from then on had him clean his glasses every morning and every evening. The Sultan knew that he could rely on the good man. But one morning, oh horror, when the Sultan put on his spectacles again, the glasses had become cloudy, and one could no longer see through them. He called Ibrahim a thief and a lazy man. But he asserted, "I am innocent, I cleaned very conscientiously, and when at last I put down my spectacles, the lenses were also bright and clear and transparent." The Sultan sent for Mariana and told her what had happened. When the old woman heard how her glasses had been handled, she became terribly angry. The woman, who was usually so calm and gentle, was as if transformed, and cried out to the Sultan, "So little have you cherished my gift. I have given you the most precious thing a man can possess, which is worth more than all your kingdom, and you have squandered and sloppily squandered it." The Sultan wanted to apologize and explain to Mariana, but she did not accept anything, became more and more vehement, and finally called out to the Sultan, "I won't help you. You don't deserve such a precious gift, you lazy one." But that was too much for Abdullah. Him, the mighty ruler, a poor old woman ventured to call a lazy man. Full of rage, he had Mariana seized and taken to prison, but he had the spectacles thrown into a well that lay in the field outside the city, and was so deep that no one had yet been able to draw water from it. That's why many people thought that this was not a real well at all, but the entrance to hell. In the people, therefore, the fountain was called the Devil's Well. Poor Mariana sat in prison with bread and water, and could think that it was not wise to express one's opinion too rudely and plainly to the faces of the powerful of this earth. And when she thought of her dear grandchild, the beautiful Fatmine, she was sad to death and wept bitter tears. But it wasn't to stay that way for long. And now listen to how that has come about. At that time a youth wandered through the east who was called Gunda the violinist among the people. He had come from a distant island, and he looked quite different from the people in the Sultan's kingdoms. He had bright blue eyes, blonde curls, and a face as rosy and delicate as peach blossom. He played the violin wherever he went, and how he played. At first it sounded like deep longing, then like joyful hope, and finally like loud jubilation and joy. There was not a man who did not follow him, and was not enchanted by the game, and as if transformed. Wicked men refrained from doing what they were up to against others, and helped those whom they had wished to harm. Old hatred vanished from the hearts, corroded resentment from the souls, and bitter enmity from the senses. The sad became merry, the oppressed cheerful, the worried confident, and the desperate trusting. Animals and plants, even lifeless nature, seemed receptive to the youth's magic tunes. The animals listened, the trees bowed, the flowers turned their heads to his play, and the houses opened their gates, doors and windows wide, wide to let the sweet sounds ring in full streams. That evening the youth entered the capital. Since it was already dark, he was not noticed, and that was just fine with him, for he wanted to go to the prison to help old Mariana, of whose sad fate he had heard. He sat down near the prison in the darkness of a wall, and waited until midnight had come and all the people were asleep. Then he began to play, at first softly, trembling and timidly, then more and more full, brighter and happier. Mariana rubbed the sleep out of her eyes and listened. She did not know how she felt. Had she been dreaming? Or did she really have her glasses back? Was the world as beautiful as it used to be? Was she living with Fatmanen again in her cosy little room? And what was that? Then the door and window of her dungeon opened, and cheering sounds streamed in, which seemed to blow up the whole house. The old woman no longer suffered it inside. She hurried away to where the sounds drew her, and no one held her back. For all the guards of the prison with many other people surrounded the wonderful youth, who, surrounded by the light of the moon, appeared magical and transfigured, like a messenger from heaven. When he saw Mariana coming, he stopped playing and let the people go back to their rooms. But he led the old woman to her house and commanded her to stay there and not to be seen. He himself did not want to linger, for he thought there was still much for him to do that night, and he hurried on to the Sultan's palace. Abdullah lay in his silken bed, but sleep fled him, for he thought of the wrong he had done Mariana, and he would gladly have exchanged places with many a poor day labourer, to whom hard work and a good conscience give him a deep sleep. Then it sounded from the street like a quiet admonition, which became more and more insistent and audible. The Sultan jumped out of bed, threw on a robe, the first best that was at hand, and hurried out of the palace alone and unseen towards the prison. He wanted to get the old woman out of prison and bring her back to her home with honour, but he did not find her. Driven by fear, he ran to her little house. Mariana recognized him from afar, for it had become light in the meantime. But she did not want the Sultan to find her. After all, the beautiful violinist had also advised her not to let herself be seen. So she told her to go down the Fatmeen and tell the Sultan that her grandmother had died in prison. The child did as he was told. The Sultan burst into tears and loud lamentations at this, and called himself the murderer of the old woman, for she must have died of grief over her imprisonment. The beautiful Fatmene felt sorry for the Sultan, and she would have liked to tell him the truth, but she was not allowed to do so, and therefore she was silent. Abdullah himself lamented her from the bottom of his heart, because she was now quite orphaned, but he would take care of the girl's welfare and send 100 camels that very day, richly laden with gold, pearls, and valuables of all kinds. Fatmeen rejected everything, but Abdullah did not relent in his entreaties and asserted, "I will not leave you alone, and if you will not accept any gift or other help from me, then I will at least stay near you, in order to be able to protect you against thieves and evil people." So the Sultan remained in the house of old Mariana and tried to comfort Fatmin as well as he could. The old grandmother, however, kept upstairs in a little room under the roof and did not show herself. The Sultan therefore still believed that the old woman had died in prison. Every evening, however, Fatmeen came to her grandmother, told her what had happened during the day, and sought advice from the clever old woman. This went on for quite some time. The Sultan, helpful wherever he could, fetched water from the well or brought their wood from the nearby forest and learned to cut it down with the axe. Fatmane sang beautiful songs to him as a thank you or told him about her experiences and the lives of other people. Instead, the Sultan again reported on his youth and how things had been at his father's court and on other princes and their fates. Time flew by for both of them, for each was new and instructive what the other knew how to tell. Every day they became happier and more familiar, and the Sultan could not wonder enough how well he felt in the little house, and how well he slept in his little room. One day, however, the Sultan's Grand Vizier came and begged his master, return to the palace. A foreign embassy has come which you must receive, and there are many other government business to be done. Deeply grieved because they were to separate, Abdullah and Fatmane sat together, and the Sultan felt that he loved the girl above all else, and could never ever leave her. So he spontaneously asked the Fatmane if she would like to become his wife and come with him to his palace. The young thing was terribly frightened by this. She, poor Fatmane, was to become sultana and move out of the modest little hut into the magnificent palace. She did not know what to reply, and instead of answering, she ran out of the room in her consternation, and up to her grandmother. She told him what had happened. The old woman had probably suspected something of the kind, for she laughed a little mischievously to herself, but did not let Fatmane, who wept and hid her face in her grandmother's lap, notice anything, but said with great earnestness, "I will give you my blessing for marriage, and let you go with the Sultan if Abdullah will restore my spectacles to me." Fatmane jumped down and said to the Sultan, "The first will gladly take you for a husband, but you must first give me back my grandmother's spectacles." The Sultan promised that this should be done at once, hastened to his palace, summoned all his soldiers and officers, and promised them half of his treasure as a reward if they would take his spectacles out of the devil's well. Many made a doubtful face about it, and would rather do without all the treasures of the world than let the devil take them in the well, and take them to hell by extra mail. But 10 particularly brave officers got together, provided themselves with long ladders and ropes, and decided to descend into the well. At first it went quite well. They lowered ladders and ropes, which they fastened to the top, deep into the well, without showing anything special. But no sooner were they preparing to descend than a hideous fellow came towards them. It must have been the devil, or one of his companions. He had fiery eyes, his breath was like pitch and brimstone, his hands had sharp claws, and a stream of fire shot out of each finger. The monster drove the brave men back and cried out in a booming voice, "Veniet ipsissimus, veniet ipsissimus." And as often as the brave renewed their attempt to descend into the shaft, by day and by night, again and again the monster came out of the depths, roared his veniat ipsissimus, and drove the men away. So at last they had to go back to the palace in deep dejection without having achieved anything. But the Sultan was much more sorrowful than she, for Fatmane insisted that she must have her spectacles back, or she would not become the Sultan's wife, and Abdullah felt more and more from day to day that he could not live without the girl. He was close to despair. At last, on the advice of his Grand Vizier, he decided to go to an ancient monk who had lived as a hermit in the desert since time immemorial, and who had a reputation for special wisdom. The Sultan presented the matter to the old man and asked for advice. "Yes," said the old man, "you must go yourself. What, I am to go into the well, into the dirty, dark well, and perhaps even let the devil take me? There will be no other way, Abdullah. For the words which the devil or whoever else it was has cried out again, and again are in Latin, and he shall come himself in his own person. For it was you who had the spectacles thrown into the well." The Sultan departed, and in a less than merciful mood, for the fact that the old man had expected him to climb into the terrible well himself did not please him at all. He spent the night sleepless. But as he saw no way out, and his longing for breaths grew ever greater, he decided to climb into the well the next morning and look for the spectacles. Nothing really moved when Abdullah descended into the shaft. The fiery monster did not appear, and the old monk seemed to have been right. The Sultan, however, descended deeper and deeper. The men who kept watch upstairs had not been able to see him for a long time, but the deeper it went down, the darker and more dreadful it became in the unfathomable shaft, so that the Sultan became quite frightened. But he did not let up. For what was life to him if he could not win his beloved Fatmeen? Hours and hours the Sultan had probably already descended. He had become more and more despondent. Even his strength threatened to leave him, when he heard indistinct noises from below, such as hammering and knocking and throbbing and beating. The further he descended, the greater the noise became, until it increased to a deafening roar. Finally, it had suddenly become quite light around him again. The Sultan stood in front of a glass door on which was written labor in gold characters. It led into a brightly lit, immeasurably wide hall. From inside came the roar, for then everything was in incessant motion. In the whole wide hall stood huge glass boxes, which were connected to each other by glass tubes. Water was constantly pumped into the boxes and discharged upwards in 1,000 different jets. Everywhere by the spraying, foaming, roaring waters, tiny dwarfs were busily and comically working, looking like little rubber men. Whether the little fellows were really made of rubber, the Sultan could not tell. As he entered, a stout elderly man came to meet him with the words, "It's good that you're coming, Abdullah. Your glasses have just been finished. We had a lot to do to make them bright again. For 4 months and 3 days we have had to wash them constantly with water, but now the glasses are light again." Meanwhile, a small rubber dwarf brought the glasses and gave them to the Sultan at the behest of his master. Abdullah did not know what to say to all this. But Mr. Labour, that was the man who had received the Sultan, said, "I have no time to talk. There must be incessant work in my workshop. Otherwise the springs, rivers and lakes on earth have no water, for I must bring it up from down here to daylight. Besides, you must hurry too, Sultan, for your companions and fat men are already awaiting your return in fear and anxiety." So the Sultan had no choice but to thank Mr. Labour briefly, and then start on his way back. In his overflowing joy he no longer felt tired. Like a squirrel he jumped up from rung to rung, and not infrequently he skipped over 1 or 2. The descent had seemed infinitely long and arduous to him. The ascent seemed to him a gimmick. When he saw the light of day again, it seemed to him as if he had climbed up in a few minutes. His companions called out to him. Another leap and the Sultan was back on the ground. But what did he look like, covered all over with dust and dirt? But he didn't ask for it. His people wanted to detain him in order to bring him another dress. But he got away and ran as fast as he could to the house of the Fatmeen. The girl saw him coming along, beaming with happiness and breathless, waving his spectacles in his uplifted hand. The grandmother called. When the old woman saw her spectacles, and the joy that shone from the child's eyes, all resentment vanished from her heart, and she ran with breaths to meet the Sultan. Abdullah, deeply moved when he saw Mariana again, sank on his knees, thanked God, and kissed the hands of both women. The old grandmother picked it up with a friendly smile, put the young couple's hands together, and blessed the two overjoyed people. The wedding was celebrated on the same day. The grandmother gave her children the glasses. She said she didn't need her anymore, but the young ones should cherish her. The two promised this and kept their word until the end of their lives, and the glasses have not become cloudy again. I hope you liked the story and are interested in more stories on this channel. If you liked it, subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss any new stories in the future. Of course, I will be happy about a like.